do hope you enjoyed the kind of preview of Game 3 of the NBA Finals coming up tonight. But we're going to transition to the Stanley Cup Finals game taking place tomorrow night between the Florida Panthers and Edmonton Oilers. Before we do, I want to remind you yet again to consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud to support the network. Me and my fellow podcasters' questions are also welcome, and they will be answered at the beginning of the next episode, so do consider that. Coming up now for our second segment of today's show, we are transitioning, as always, in this kind of heavy finals period from basketball to hockey, where Game 3 of the Florida Panthers and Edmonton Oilers Stanley Cup Finals series will take place tomorrow night. Now, let's just go over the money line and the kind of over-under in terms of points. As the series shifts to Edmonton, so does this kind of money line. We look at the money line for this game, and it says Edmonton minus 125 and Florida plus 115. The total points for this game is 5.5. Kind of always sits in that range for any playoff hockey game because of the fact that no one knows if offense or defense will win the day in any given night. Let's switch over to fantasy. And in terms of the Florida Panthers, it always starts and ends with the man in net, Sergei Bobrovsky. $10K for a goalkeeper. The most expensive player for the Florida Panthers is a goalkeeper. We're going to get into why that is kind of when I go into my next segment about the Florida Panthers and their whole fantasy story. $10K. 13.4 DraftKings fantasy points projected for Sergei Bobrovsky tomorrow night. And then I kind of wanted to highlight this guy like I did in previous episodes this week because of the fact he's kind of coming on as this series progresses. He necessarily was not as good in other playoff series. Evan Rodriguez, their second-line winger, 5.6K. He's still not in that range where his price is inflating in fantasy, so take him while he is still lower valued. 7.6 DraftKings fantasy points in terms of him. Evan Rodriguez, a player to watch in this final series, one of the most exciting players to watch in this series, in my honest opinion, because of the fact he has been scoring in bunches, 3 goals in 2 games. I'm excited to see what he does in this one. Moving over to the Edmonton Oilers, I really can't say I'm confident in picking an Edmonton Oiler right now in this series, but should you feel so inclined, Connor McDavid is going to have to be the guy to get the Edmonton Oilers engine running. 11K valuation. He is predicted to have 15.1 DraftKings fantasy points tomorrow night, so they are expecting him, as the series shifts back to Rogers Place in Edmonton, McDavid to step up his game. But if you want a guy who I'm really high on as kind of a fantasy wild card because of the fact he constantly gets rotated in and out of the squad, but still can add huge, tremendous value to an Edmonton Oilers defense who's currently looking for answers as to how to maintain that defensive mindset and solidity, both in their penalty kill and at even strength, look at Ryan McLeod. 3.4K valuation, very low for a defenseman, even though he is a defenseman, and only 3.6 DraftKings fantasy points. Now, obviously, this is a risk because, as we all know, Chris Knoblauch is always experimenting with the defense, and that is one of the keys to how Edmonton can get back into this series. Which defenseman makes Stuart Skinner more comfortable? As we saw in the Dallas Stars Conference Final Series, Ryan McLeod was a huge game changer in that regard. Really helped Stuart Skinner get the Oilers back into the series. And so, should Ryan McLeod play tomorrow, look for him to have a fantastic game because of the fact he seems to be one of those defenders that can just come in and really say, hey guys, I know we're struggling, but let's keep it together and maybe we'll get something out of this game. And that just needs to be the mindset for the Edmonton Oilers as a whole as the series shifts back to their hometown. The Rogers Place will obviously be hopping. It's been a fantastic playoff atmosphere for all these years of the Edmonton Oilers trying to get back into that contention status. And so, look for this hometown crowd to kind of carry Edmonton through. I still think Florida is just too dangerous. They might steal a game at home. I do think Edmonton will win a game at home in this series. They're going to have to now as they want to get back into the series. So they will definitely do that in my personal opinion, but the Florida Panthers are just too good to not at least split those two away games. But this game just feels like a game where Chris Knoblauch needs to get his choices right. I feel like Edmonton has the potential to finally break through against Sergei Bobrovsky, solve the unsolvable, but it just needs to come from Chris Knoblauch getting his rotation right, understanding how to set up not just in terms of Oilers' strength, but also their weaknesses, because right now the Oilers' weaknesses are the most prevalent thing about them in this series. They are not fantastic at even strength right now. And Stuart Skinner does not necessarily feel confident in his defensemen at even strength. So we'll have to see how Chris Knoblauch experiments and puts out a team that he truly believes can steal some of these games at home in the series. But I do think this series is very interesting fantasy-wise, mainly due to the fact that Sergei Bobrovsky has just been getting so much attention at the goaltender spot in fantasy. You don't necessarily see it that often, that a goalie all of a sudden surges so high up the fantasy rankings, as we're going to discuss tomorrow in another segment where I go over the betting odds for Conn Smythe MVP awards for this Stanley Cup playoff run. I do think that Sergei Bobrovsky's status has truly been elevated and it's a sight to behold. On the Edmonton Oilers side of things, I'm surprised that Connor McDavid is rated as highly as he is right now because of the fact that, yes, he does have an assist in this series. He finally broke the duck in terms of points in the Stanley Cup Finals. Only goal and assist in the Stanley Cup Finals thus far for Edmonton, and that's going to have to change. But right now, Connor McDavid, his kind of run is cooled down considerably, and going back home, he definitely needs a game where he kind of settles down. And ultimately, this whole Edmonton Oilers offensive mindset is entirely up to him. He is the guy who has the pace and electricity to confuse and confound the Florida Panthers defense, but his teammates need to elevate around him as well. He needs to find a way to get his teammates, his line mates, to step up to his level. Because right now, all I'm seeing at even strength for the Edmonton Oilers is Connor McDavid entering the zone at pace and no one following up to kind of crash the glass, kind of get more active in the forecheck, on the rush, what have you, to kind of help Connor McDavid. Because right now, he just looks like a headless chicken running around. He just looks kind of lost. He doesn't know who to rely on because of the fact that the Florida Panthers cover everything so well in front of Bobrovsky, and then there's Bobrovsky, who's been impossible to get beyond. So that's going to have to be one of the areas where Edmonton steps up. How they revolve around Connor McDavid when they are in the Florida Panthers defensive zone. For the Florida Panthers end, just keep doing what you're doing, man. I know it's cliche to say, I've said it all week, but just keep doing what you're doing. Obviously, in Game 1, they kind of stole that game away from Edmonton. Edmonton really could have won that game if their scoring boots were on. But ultimately, the Florida Panthers just have so much depth. And I'm really going to try and dissect it in a couple segments from now. But still, the Florida Panthers, this looks like their series to lose right now. And they really have the opportunity to stick their neck and throat again in this case, in this series, because of the fact that they have the goalie, they have the defense, and they have just enough offensive juice to carry them over the line. Ultimately, they want to do it to kind of avenge last season's loss. They just have so much spirit. That's another thing. They just have so much spirit. You can see it with so many of their fantasy players stepping up. Rodriguez was not a factor in my mind in the series in the slightest. And he has become one of their best fantasy players, and a guy who I would immediately want to steal while he is still kind of in this cheaper range. And so, ultimately, if you're the Florida Panthers, you gotta like where you're at right now. Obviously, the Edmonton Oilers' home ice advantage is a very, very, very scary arena to enter into. But the Florida Panthers, if any team can do it, it's them. I'm really, really intrigued to see how this plays out. Can Edmonton Stars get it going? Or can the Florida Panthers team continue staying within their system, staying within themselves, elevating each other beyond what they know they can be? Obviously, the Barkov injury is a bit scary to me, but ultimately I think they have enough to kind of cover for him. He is kind of one of the vital pieces of this team, but they just have so much depth, so I'm not necessarily too worried about them kind of not getting any more offensive production than they already are. But still, if you're Florida, keep doing what you're doing. If you're Edmonton, you gotta find a way to get your offensive juice back. But that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, like I said before, I'm going to be looking at these two leaders of these respective finals in both the Boston Celtics and the Florida Panthers and kind of their fantasy stories. What makes them so weird in the way that they don't necessarily have one true superstar in terms of fantasy. And then also kind of dissect how people, you as a fantasy playing public, kind of view them as players in your squad. So it should be kind of these two intriguing segments that I'm really excited to present to you guys. We'll be right back with those. They should be fantastic.